Okay, welcome to Lesson 4 of Writing Through the Wardrobe. We're going to be talking about dramatic irony in this lesson. Dramatic irony is one of those literary terms that you learn, again, in your language arts class. And I'm not sure it's always clear to writers or to readers or writers why this idea is so important. But I think dramatic irony is a really key part of what makes a story compelling, or let's just say it can be a key part of what makes a story compelling. And it certainly is one of the things that makes The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe compelling. So we're going to be looking at Edmund and his experience with the White Witch in chapter 4. I think we're in chapter 4 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the chapter called Turkish Delight. All kinds of irony. We're going to talk about 3 kinds of irony briefly, and then I'm going to zero in on dramatic irony because that's really what's important for what we're talking about right now in this lesson. But all kinds of irony are about a gap between, well, let's just look. Of our 3 kinds of irony, verbal irony, situational irony, and dramatic irony, all 3 of those ironies are gaps. So, verbal irony is just a gap between what you really mean and what the words sound like they mean. But verbal irony, sometimes people use the word sarcasm as a synonym for verbal irony. I don't like that. I don't like to use those words as synonyms because sarcasm by definition is, or I guess I should say by etymology, is a very negative thing. It literally means the tearing of the flesh. If you go back to the Greek that it comes from, sarcasm is a flesh-tearing way of talking to people, and also not all sarcasm is verbal irony. But so you do this all the time in your everyday speech. You use verbal irony all the time. So if the weather's bad, you might say, "Lovely weather we're having," right? This person is using verbal irony, right? She's in the middle of a storm. The sea is about to crush her, and she says, "Lovely weather we're having." All right, that's verbal irony. Usually, verbal irony is it sort of just happens on a one-off sentence basis, right? You don't write a whole work of verbal irony normally. Now, an exception that a lot of people are familiar with is Jonathan Swift's pamphlet, A Modest Proposal, and in this pamphlet, he says, I'm going to give you, he was from the 18th century and actually lived in Ireland, and this was at a time when the Irish people were very much really struggling. They were ruled by the English, and things weren't going well at all in Ireland, and there was always this so-called Irish problem that people were proposing, writing pamphlets about various solutions. And Jonathan Swift wrote a pamphlet that he called A Modest Proposal that seemed like a serious suggestion for a plan for dealing with the Irish problem. And the long and short of it is he's proposing that the Irish babies be raised to be eaten. Of course, that's not what he meant. What he meant was, we need to take better care of the Irish, and in effect, we're already, eating, in a figurative way, eating them and destroying their lives and livelihood. And so that was a whole pamphlet that meant the opposite of what it appeared to mean. But that's unusual. Usually when we talk about verbal irony, we're really just talking about, a little facetious, where you say the opposite of what you really mean. Moving on to situational irony. This is just situational irony. It just means things are turning out the opposite of what you expected them, of the way you expected them to turn out. And again, a lot of times when we use the word ironic in everyday life, that's what we mean. Like, isn't it ironic that I bought a ticket to this play, and then it turns out tickets were free. That they were letting other people in for free. I mean, that's how we typically use the word ironic in everyday life. If you've ever read any stories by O. Henry, His stories are very much driven by situational irony. So this is going to be a bit of a spoiler, but a lot of people know the story already. The story, The Gift of the Magi. In that story, there's this young married couple that love each other very much. They're very poor, and the husband, his prized possession is a pocket watch, but he doesn't have a chain for it. And the wife has very beautiful hair. That's kind of her prized possession, is her hair. And so he gets it in his head that he wants to buy her these beautiful combs for her hair for their first Christmas together. And so he sells his pocket watch to have the money to buy her combs. And then she wants to buy a chain for his pocket watch, so she cuts off her hair and sells her hair so she can buy the chain. And so that situational irony, right? Things turned out the opposite of what they expected them to. He buys combs for a woman who doesn't have any hair. She buys a chain for a man who doesn't have a pocket watch. So that's a gap between expectation and actuality. The kind of irony I want to talk about in this lesson, the one that is so important to the way we understand Edmund, for instance, is dramatic irony. And that's the gap between what the characters know and understand about their situation and what the audience knows and understands about the character's situation, okay? And so that gap, there are kind of two main ways that gap gets formed. The first is just for the audience to be provided with information that the characters don't have. Think about in a play when the bad guy comes out, in scene 2 and says, "Here's the awful thing I'm going to do, and I'm going to trick the people into trusting me." And then in the next scene, he then starts going about that plan, and we know that he's a villain and the other people don't. And so there's this gap between what while we sit in the audience, we know, don't trust this guy, or if you watch a horror movie, you're always saying, don't go in there, and then they go in there, right? They go into the woods, or they go into the closet, or wherever the bad guy is. That is dramatic irony. Again, that's one kind of dramatic irony where we are given information that the character doesn't have. And so in, I guess that's Romeo and Juliet there, kissing one another. In Romeo and Juliet, when, Juliet takes the sleeping potion where she looks dead, and Romeo is so sad that he kills himself. We as the audience know the real situation. We're like, don't kill yourself, Romeo, and he does. And then she wakes up and kills herself. So sometimes dramatic irony is really useful in a tragic sense. Othello, Iago, the bad guy, comes out on stage and rubs his hands together and says, "I'm really a bad guy, and I'm going to trick Othello into thinking his wife has been unfaithful to him," and then Othello doesn't know something we know, which is that Iago is a bad guy. Okay, so that is the tragic use of dramatic irony. You see it all the time in Greek tragedy. In Oedipus Rex, we know that he has killed his father and married his mother. He doesn't know that, and the whole play is that gap closing between what there's when the play starts, there's this much gap between what he knows and what we know, and then as that play reaches its climax, he begins to know what we know, and then his life falls apart, right? And that's how dramatic irony works in tragedy. It also often is used in comedy. And that typically is in our second source of dramatic irony, and that is that the character has limitations that we in the audience don't have. So the character, maybe the character is just a child and we are grown-ups and we understand their situation more than they do. Maybe they're foolish, maybe they are naive, maybe they're a duck. There is a, in the play, not the play, the little picture book, Make Way for Ducklings, there's that, I don't know if you remember that story, but at one point Mr. Duck sees a big swan boat, the kind of boat that you paddle around and it looks like a swan. And he mistakes it for an enormous, swan, and tries to have a conversation with the swan boat. And we as readers, even very young readers, they think that's funny because they know that they understand, they have, Mr. Duck has limitations that they don't have, and so they understand that it's not a real swan he's talking to, and hilarity ensues, right? Or if you think about Huck Finn, and I've mentioned him once or twice already, as he narrates his story, he has a very, in some ways, very innocent view of the world where he finds himself, and so as he interprets those events, we understand things that he doesn't seem to understand, especially, there's a moment where he thinks he's going to go to hell because he has helped a slave escape. And of course, from where we sit, we can see, no, that's not you're not being a sinful person by helping a slave and being kind to Jim. And so that's another instance of sometimes, that dramatic irony is funny in Huck Finn, and sometimes it's actually quite touching and moving. So anyway, it's all about a gap between what we know and what the character knows. And again, that gap may appear because we're given information that they don't have, or it may appear because we understand things that they don't understand. And again, often, and we're going to see this in a little while, in a subsequent lesson. So what we're going to talk about in this lesson is the way, specifically in the character of Edmund, how Lewis opens up a gap between what Edmund understands and what we understand. And then later in the book, about the time Aslan, arrives and starts to set things right, that gap closes, and Edmund begins to understand what we've understood for a long time. And so we'll get to that when we get to it, but this lesson is about how that gap gets opened up. So let's look at this. Okay, this is where Edmund first encounters the White Witch. And she, she's on her sledge. She sees Edmund for the first time, and so as she spoke these words, she rose from her seat and looked Edmund full in the face, her eyes flaming. At the same moment, she raised her wand. Edmund felt sure that she was going to do something dreadful, but he seemed unable to move. Okay, now in this moment, Edmund's assessment of the situation is exactly the same as our assessment, right? When we see this queen and she raises a wand, and we've already heard she's a bad person, we expect something bad to happen. So does Edmund, right? He was unable to move. All right, so at this moment, there isn't a big gap between what we understand about the situation and what Edmund understands. There may be a slight gap because we've already heard that she's the kind of person who can turn people into stone, right? We know that from an earlier chapter 2, I guess it was, when Tumnus explains that to Lucy. So we have a little bit of information that Edmund doesn't have, but Edmund's assessment of his situation here is pretty much the same as our assessment of his situation, right? Okay, now moving on. This is later. If you remember, she suddenly sweetens up when she realizes that he is a son of Adam and that she needs to capture a son of Adam. She sweetens up. And at that point, a gap starts to open, doesn't it? Because we know she's bad. We know that he is in trouble. And he doesn't quite understand that. Now, some of that is going to be because, again, we have information he doesn't have. But more of that comes from the fact that Edmund is a different kind of person than we are, right? Edmund is driven by his appetites, and his appetites make it impossible for him to judge rightly. So remember, I said sometimes that gap opens from a deficiency that the character has that the audience doesn't have, and there's going to be plenty of that going on here. Okay, so if you remember, again, on the last slide, Edmund is appropriately afraid of the queen. He sees things more or less the way we see things, but now he's eating this Turkish Delight, and something has started to change in him. While he was eating, the queen kept asking him questions. At first, Edmund tried to remember that it is rude to speak with one's mouth full, but soon he forgot about this and thought only of trying to shovel down as much Turkish Delight as he could. And the more he ate, the more he wanted to eat, and he never asked himself why the queen should be so inquisitive. Okay, so feel that gap opening up here, right? On the previous slide, we felt the same thing about the situation that Edmund does. Now we feel very different from Edmund, right? He's shoveling in the thing and we're saying, Edmund, stop, don't do this, right? Edmund, you're doomed, right? And he can't feel it. And he never asked himself why the queen should be so inquisitive. Well, we know, right? We understand why she's asking these questions. Or let's just say we're starting to. I don't know that I can't remember the details here, just how much my point though is, however much we understand, it's more than Edmund does. And Edmund, the lack that Edmund has here, it is a result of his foolishness. It's not that he doesn't have enough information, okay? True, we have a little more information than he does, but that's not the real problem here. The real problem is that he's being driven by his appetites. He's also being bewitched, right? And so here we have a situation in which, again, that gap is opening up. Okay, you're sure that there are just 4 of you, she asked? 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve, neither more nor less? And Edmund, with his mouthful of Turkish Delight, kept on saying, yes, I told you that before, and forgetting to call her your majesty. But she didn't seem to mind now. All right. Now, for you and me, this seems a little ominous that she didn't mind, right? For him, it feels like he's getting very comfortable, and if you're the person in that situation and you're getting more and more comfortable, your situation seems to be better and better, and we still know, right, that he's in big trouble. So he's not, we're getting all these clues. The narrator and or C.S. Lewis is giving us all these clues as to what's really going on. And again, I want you to pay attention to this. I love this idea, and I'm going to keep coming back to it, of our judgment as the reader, right? The narrator is not saying to us, okay, dear reader, I'm sure you're aware, this Edmund's in big trouble here. That's not how this is working, right? We have sense enough to read the clues here, and Edmund doesn't have sense enough to see that. Now, it's not hard to imagine a similar situation in which that's played for laughs, right? A comical situation, but this isn't a comical situation. This is Edmund really, getting himself in serious trouble, and again, his foolishness, it's not, it kind of makes us feel wise, doesn't it? And that's one of the great pleasures of dramatic irony, is that we know more about the character situation than they know about their situation, and it's kind of a good feeling, right? We enjoy knowing more than somebody else, even if that person is a fictional character. So this is a technique, this gap I'm talking about, serves a lot of purposes, not the least of which is just pleasure for your reader. But that's probably not the most important thing that's going on here, the pleasure of knowing more than Edmund. I mean, we really do start to feel some, eventually we start to feel some pity for him, and the fact that we can see him getting deeper and deeper into trouble. Remember, if you're in this situation, it's hard to understand what's going on. And the fact that we're not in this situation makes this a learning experience in a way that it doesn't seem to be a learning experience for for Edmund. At least not yet. He'll learn eventually when he almost gets himself in more trouble than let's just say he does get himself into more trouble he can get himself out of. Thankfully, Aslan comes along and saves the day. Okay, why can't we go to your house now, said Edmund. When he first got onto the sledge, he had been afraid that she might drive away with him to some unknown place from which he would not be able to get back, right? When he first got onto the sledge, he had the same assessment that we had, but he had forgotten about that fear now, okay? Now, again, this is the result of an enchantment It's also the result of his appetite. It's also the result of his tendency toward foolishness from day one, right? We've known, and if you go back and reread chapters 1 and 2 and 3, you begin to see some clues of this foolishness. And Edmund is a person who is susceptible to this kind of enchantment that the witch has put him under. So it's not just that he's an innocent victim, and yet he's still a victim, right? He's a person who is susceptible to her kind of enchantment. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, this is a really fascinating moment of dramatic irony here. I want a nice boy whom I could bring up as a prince and who would be king of Narnia when I'm gone, and you are much the cleverest and handsomest young man I've ever met. I think I would like to make you the prince someday when you bring the others to visit me. All right, of course, that's the white witch talking to him, and we already have some questions about him being the cleverest and the handsomest, right? And so we judge her statement differently from the way he's going to judge her statement. Again, think about judgment. Think about engaging your reader's judgment when you write stories. Why not now, said Edmund. His face had become very red and his mouth and fingers were sticky. He did not look either clever or handsome, whatever the queen might say. All right, so our narrator is emphasizing, sort of doubling down on this gap between what we see. We see a sort of piggish, sticky red boy who looks and acts like pretty foolish, and he sees himself as a potential prince. Clever, handsome, all that kind of stuff. So this gap. I mean, sometimes there are some things that Lewis does that we can look at and say, look how much we can learn from this. And when we were talking about description in I think the last lesson, I was able to say, you don't have to be a genius to be able to do this. The truth is, some of this is kind of hard, but I still think you can do it. I mean, I think when you are aware of how are you going to create a gap between what the character sees and what the reader knows. Again, sometimes it's a matter of giving them extra information. That's especially not easy, but it's easier when you've got an omniscient narrator, right? Because the narrator already knows everything and can tell the reader choice bits of information. But I think it's really even more interesting when you can create a gap that derives from that character's deficiencies, whether they are young or foolish or naive, or sometimes just morally deficient. And this is one thing that's being illustrated here is that when you are morally deficient, you really misunderstand what you know and understand. And that's exactly what's going on with our boy Edmund here. I'm not going to say much about this, but it feels especially ironic when Edmund says, there's nothing special about them. Remember when the white witch is trying to get him to bring his siblings to her, and he says there's nothing special about them. Well, we know they're special, right? We've seen them in action, and actually Edmund is the one we like the least. And so this is it feels like the gap between his understanding and ours is becoming a chasm, right? Okay, I think that's all. Yeah, that's all we've got to say. That's all I've got to say for now about dramatic irony. It'll come up again. So that's the end of Lesson 4. For Lesson 5, we're going to talk about that much maligned literary technique, exposition.